Welcome to the fifth session in our series on the Kingdom of God. In earlier sessions, we've seen that from the beginning, God's goal for all of history was to bring glory to himself by spreading his kingdom to the ends of the earth through the service of his images. This is why Jesus told his followers to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And it's also why we look to Jesus, the perfect man who fulfills the spread of the kingdom of God around the world. So far, we've concentrated on the primeval history of the Bible. At that time, the place of God's kingdom on earth was the Garden of Eden, and God commanded his images, Adam and Eve, to go beyond the garden's borders by filling the earth with his images and by having dominion over the earth in service to God the King. We also saw that in primeval history, humanity fell into rebellion against God, but God was patient and established the order of nature that we experience today until Earth's history could be fulfilled. Now we're ready to look at the next major stage of God's kingdom in the history of the Bible, the period when God chose the people of Israel and placed them in their promised land as the centerpiece of his kingdom on earth. Let's start by noticing the place of God's kingdom during the time of the nation of Israel.
Now that we've seen what the Scriptures teach about the kingdom of God during the primeval history, we're ready to move to the next major stage of kingdom history in the Old Testament, the period in which God dealt especially with the nation of Israel as the chosen people of his kingdom.
It's difficult to miss the fact that the nation of Israel plays a central role in biblical history. But why? The Scriptures focus on the people of Israel because God chose them to lead the entire human race in the service he had ordained for his images from the beginning. The Israelites were the seed of the woman, the royal priesthood, his treasured possession, his firstborn among the nations. And as such, they were to grow in number and have dominion over the earth in service to God's kingdom. Now, the Israelites repeatedly failed to be faithful to God, and God brought severe judgment against them, but God never canceled this role for Israel. As we're about to see, throughout the Scriptures, God remained committed to Israel, leading all the nations into his service.
To see how the kingdom of God unfolded throughout the history of the nation of Israel, we'll look again at three topics. First, we'll explore the place or location of the kingdom. Second, we'll look at the people of the kingdom in the nation of Israel. And third, we'll sketch the progress of the kingdom in Israel. Let's look first at the place of God's kingdom.
When God first put Adam and Eve on earth, he planted them in a special place, in the Garden of Eden. But he also commissioned them to serve as his images by establishing his will throughout the whole world. Now, as we're about to see, when God chose Abraham and his descendants, he called for them to orient themselves toward the vicinity of Eden once again, and from there, to fulfill humanity's original commission.
Listen to the way Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, describes when God first called Abraham, the father of Israel, to be his special servant. God said, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Notice the geographical focus of this passage. God called Abraham to leave his father's homeland in Mesopotamia and to migrate to a land Abraham had not yet seen. God led Abraham from Ur in Mesopotamia to Haran, and later God called Abraham from Haran to the land of Canaan, the land that we often call the Promised Land. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, God confirmed that his descendants would take possession of that place as their enduring homeland. And from that time forward, the Promised Land became the staging ground for Israel's kingdom service. Abraham's call to the Promised Land helps us understand the place of God's kingdom in the history of Israel in at least two ways. First, God called Abraham and his descendants to serve him at the original geographical center of his kingdom. Second, God called Israel to carry out the geographical expansion of his kingdom beyond the borders of the Promised Land. Let's look at the idea that God called Abraham and his descendants to serve him at the original center of his kingdom on earth. A few moments ago, we saw that the original centerpiece of God's earthly kingdom was the land of Eden and the sacred garden within it. Unfortunately, many biblical interpreters have mistakenly assumed that Eden was somewhere in lower Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf. We don't know for certain how much territory was considered the land of Eden. It could have extended throughout what we now call the Fertile Crescent. But the book of Genesis itself closely associates the land and Garden of Eden with the land that God promised to Abraham. This geographical orientation becomes clear in Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14, where God described the boundaries of Eden. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Notice here that 4 primeval rivers are associated with Eden. The first 2 are the Pishon and the Gihon. Scholars still debate where these rivers were located, but here they're associated with the land of Havilah and Cush to the southwest of the Promised Land. The second 2, the Tigris and the Euphrates, stream eastward from the mountainous regions of modern Syria. Understanding this much about the locations of the rivers of Eden is important because, broadly speaking, these locations correlate with rivers that were also associated later in the book of Genesis with the land God promised to Abraham. Listen to Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. And the way God described the land he promised to Abraham and his descendants. To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. As we see here, rivers mark the boundaries of Israel's promised land, the river of Egypt and the river Euphrates. Most interpreters rightly agree that the river of Egypt was not the Nile, but was one of a number of rivers, or wadis, in northeastern Egypt. Beyond this, the river Euphrates, the upper Euphrates in modern western Syria, marked the northeastern boundary of the Promised Land. Later in biblical history, these rivers marked the extent of Israel's lands during the reigns of David and Solomon. As we can see, the Promised Land's geographical boundaries roughly parallel the boundaries of the land of Eden. So, as other biblical passages indicate, when God called Abraham to Canaan, he called him back to the original centerpiece of Earth's geography, to Eden, where Adam and Eve first began to serve God's kingdom. The place of Eden not only helps us understand that God first called Abraham and later brought Moses to the original geographical center of God's kingdom, it also indicates that Israel's promised land was the starting point for the geographical expansion of God's reign through Israel to the ends of the earth. According to God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, possessing the promised land was for a much greater purpose. As God said, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." In this passage, God directly drew Abraham's attention to the impact he and his descendants would have on all nations. God promised to bless and curse other nations in response to their reaction to Abraham. But notice the final result of this twofold process. God promised that Abraham and his descendants would bring God's blessings to all the families of the earth. This is why, in Romans chapter 4, verse 13, the Apostle Paul summarized God's promise to Abraham and his seed in this way: Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world. Adam and Eve were called to fill the entire earth and to have dominion over it. But sin had divided the human race between those who served God and those who did not. But God chose Abraham and Israel to bring his blessings to all nations on earth who would receive him. And as followers of Christ, we know that this promise is fulfilled through Jesus, the perfect son of Abraham. The people of Israel were well aware that they were destined to serve God's purposes by possessing more than the Promised Land. In the days of Moses, 2.5 tribes received permission to occupy lands east of the Jordan. And David, Solomon, and other kings in David's dynasty extended Israel's borders to the north, to the east, and to the south. Even when Israel was sent into exile, the prophets reassured God's people that not only would they return to the Promised Land, but the Messiah would one day lead them in spreading God's kingdom to the ends of the earth.